Hey YouTube, this is tcgsam here, and in today's video I'm going to be going over part 2 of my series on how to approach a new format as a competitive player. If you haven't checked out part 1 already, in that video I talk about how to actually go about choosing the right deck for you, and in today's video I'm going to be going over how to actually go ahead and build that deck once you've chosen the right one. If you haven't checked out part 1, I would recommend you check it out, but you don't have to have seen it in order for this video to be helpful. But without any further ado, let's hop straight into it. And now the biggest question all of you probably have is, why don't I just take a successful deck list and then go with that at the start of a format? Why do I actually need to build the deck from scratch? And my answer to that is, you could just do that. And honestly, I would recommend that you do that, especially if you're newer to the deck you're playing. You don't really understand like why certain ratios of cards are being played, and or you don't really understand why cards are needed or not needed in the deck. I recommend going with a successful deck list or a deck list that someone else has made, just so you can get a better idea of what the cards do before you start tinkering with it. But the purpose of this video is going to be going over how you can actually take those already successful deck lists and understand them at a more fundamental level, so when you want to go make changes to it, these changes that you're making are going to make sense and give you the best chance of doing well at your next big tournament. In front of me here, I have the top 8 deck list from YCS Columbus for the Doomsday deck, and I'm going to be going over the process that I would take when it comes to breaking down these decks and analyzing whether or not I should change things in this deck list. So to start off at a high level, I'll take a look at the starters in the deck that are being played, the extenders in the deck that are being played, and the non-engine and the engine requirements. I think that no matter what format you're in, no matter what deck you're taking a look at, every single Yu-Gi-Oh deck that you will ever build, I think will need to take into consideration all 4 of those elements. And so those are the biggest things I'll look out for. So let's start off with this Doomsday deck, taking a look at what its starter cards are. The general game plan of this deck is to cycle through most, if not all, the effects in the deck by consistently ranking up their monsters into the Xyz monster, going through a card like Reflerio, going through their spell, and then just basically establishing an end board that has Drastia, has access to the trap card, has some generic end board pieces like Varudras, and so our starters are going to be the cards that help us get there. And in the Doomsday deck specifically, those are going to be cards like Alara, Amalth, cards like Doomsday Change, and cards like Power Patron Terminus, in terms of 1-card combos at least. Of course, there are combinations of cards that do work as starters to get your play started, but for the purposes of this stage of deck building, I'm just going to be taking a look at strictly the cards that start their plays on their own. And now the general rule of thumb that I will always look to follow for these starter cards is I should be maxing out on as many copies of these as possible, because I want my deck to be as consistent as possible. And in this case, we see that this deck list is maxing out on everything except for Amalth. And at this point, I think, okay, it makes sense to max out on copies of a starter, so why is Amalth only being played at 2? I think the obvious reason is that, of course, we have an additional starter in Medius Appear, which can sort of act as quote-unquote a third Amalth, because Medius Appear does get you to your combo as well. So, in general, I think that this choice at least makes some sense, but then the next question is, okay, why are we not still playing 3 Amalth anyways if we really want to maximize consistency? And it's at this point, I'll consider whether or not these make sense in the context of like good deck building. And one of the principles of good deck building is that, okay, you want to make sure that yes, you have a bunch of starters, you have a bunch of consistency, but you don't want so many to the point where you have redundancy. As a hypothetical example, let's say I had 20 cards in my deck that basically did the same thing in terms of starting my plays. Yes, that makes my deck very consistent, but then I don't have enough space for cards like extenders or non-engine. Those are other parts of a successful deck, and so I'll need to ask myself, what is the right number of starters to play in my deck? In this case, I think the very obvious reason why we're not playing more is because, well, these cards are all normal summons. If you see a hand with too many normal summons, a lot of the times you won't be able to get value out of those cards, and they won't be able to help you push your plays through if your opponent does have a way to stop your normal summon starter. Medius does also have some extra synergy with a card like Terminus, but strictly just in terms of starter cards, I think that both Medius and Amalfi are comparable in this deck, each with their own pros and cons. And so at least for now, just when doing this preliminary deck building analysis, I would say that this is probably something that I'll probably look into more during testing. So I'll make a mental note of things like, okay, during testing, I need to look out for which one of these cards feels better and whether or not I need, let's say, one of Medius to search off of a card like Terminus. So in terms of the starters, I think generally the ratios here all make sense. So I'm going to move on to looking at the next part of the deck, which are the extenders that can pair with your starters, pair with other extenders to help you push your plays through when your opponent has a way to interrupt you. The first most interesting one is going to be Drastia in this deck. Like I mentioned, one of the deck's game plans is to always get to Drastia and have it as a part of its end board. It gives you another way to rank up into an Xyz to climb into a card like Reflerio on your turn in some circumstances. This list is choosing to play 3, and I personally think 3 makes a lot of sense. Once you've played this deck a few times, you'll understand that the deck always wants to cycle through this card, and so hard drawing it means that you have a better chance of playing through interruptions that your opponent has. And so I think that even though Drastia isn't necessarily a card that does a lot on its own, it doesn't really require that much to get going. It works with pretty much every single one of your starters. It works with pretty much every single one of your extenders. I think it makes a lot of sense for you to play 3 copies of this card just to max it out, give yourself the best chance of playing through your opponent's interactions. In terms of other extenders, the Pendulum Doomsday monster, you can consider it a quote-unquote pseudo-starter as long as you have another Doomsday card. But in general, I consider cards like these more like extenders since they do require other cards to make it work. In terms of other extenders, Doomsday Raiders is in a similar boat. Yes, this card can be a starter, but you do need other cards with it, and so I think it behaves a little bit more like an extender. There are also a few other quote-unquote extenders. Vidolium is an extender you search off of one of your starters, and Vidolia is another extender that you can do search during your combo. Now, I think it makes a lot of sense to play 3 copies of Raiders and 3 copies of the Pendulum because these cards don't require that many other cards for you to really get going. Like, in fact, these cards just require another Doomsday card. But cards like Vidolium and Vidolia, they can get you to some of your plays. But in general, these are not cards you necessarily want to see because 1, because they're so accessible, and 2, even if they do go off, you don't actually get that much from resolving these cards. And so in theory, at least, I think it makes sense to play 1 and 1. And I'll make a quick mental note to look out for whether or not I end up needing more copies of this during testing, or whether or not these cards end up being better than I expected during testing. Like, let's say if I only open Vidolia or only open Vidolium, how often am I winning those games when I don't have anything else? But at least for now, I think in theory, at least, it makes a lot of sense for us to only play 1 copy of each. And then for the next part of the deck, we're going to take a look at the engine requirements or cards that you don't necessarily want to see in your hand, but you do need to play in your deck for it to function well. And in this deck, there are quite a few, which is something that I think is a little bit of a red flag in deck building. When you have a deck that requires a lot of quote-unquote bad cards in your deck to draw, maybe that's a sign that that deck is not either not optimized or it's not a very good deck to begin with. But let's take a look and see whether or not all of these are actually needed in the deck in the first place. So this list chose to play 1 of each copy of the Equip Spell. Adrastia, I think, is definitely too important not to play. This is what allows your Alar to work as a starter, so I don't think you can actually cut this. Playing 1 of it, of course, makes sense. You don't want to see it. It's a very accessible card, so you won't ever need more than 1 copy of it, especially because it can also recur itself from the graveyard. Doomdirk is something that you pretty much only exclusively equip with Drastia, so you want to ask yourself, do I actually need this card in my deck? Because in theory, can't I, for example, just cut it and only play a copy of Adrastia? Well, the answer to that, I think, is no, because like I said, you do go through the both effects of Adrastia during your combo, meaning if you want your Adrastia to be live as an interruption, you need another Equip Spell. But I know you're probably thinking that still doesn't really answer the question of like why we need Doomdirk specifically. Like, why can't it just be either, let's say, another copy of Adrastia, which isn't nearly as dead as a card like Doomdirk, or why can't it be like a generic Equip Spell that maybe isn't Doomsday specific, but can still make it so Adrastia is live? I think this is something that I would make a mental note of for my testing purposes. I'll ask myself, why are these players playing this specific card in the deck as opposed to some other alternatives that could work, at least in theory? So at this point, I'll say, okay, maybe we don't need a card like Doomdirk. What if we cut Doomdirk and just played another random Equip Spell instead? Would my combo still work? And that's something I would ultimately need to find out through my testing, which I will go over in the next and final part of this series. Now, getting on to the other engine requirements, Power Patron Doomsday. If you've seen any of the Doomsday combos, this is a card that you do go through quite a lot. Not only do you use this search effect, you actually quite often use this on-field effect as well. But unlike even a card like Vidolium or a Vidolia, this card actually doesn't do anything on its own. If you see only this card with, like, let's say 4 non-engine cards, this card's not doing anything. And so I think it falls more to the engine requirement category. That being said, though, this is definitely a card you can't cut. You need it in all of your combos. So I think for now, playing 1 copy if it makes sense. It's not the worst card to draw in the world either, because at least it pairs very well with a lot of your other extenders in the deck, like the Pendulum Monster or Drastia. Another engine requirement is going to be Doomsday Destruction. I'll say not only is it pretty necessary for the Doomsday end board, because it makes it so certain board breakers don't just completely invalidate your board, it also has that extra bonus effect of being able to equip Doomsday monster from deck to another monster on the field, and that's actually used in some combos. And so ultimately, I think that Doomsday Destruction is a little bit too important of a card to cut. I'll also make a quick mental note of this to look more into during testing, and ask myself whether or not I can just maybe like side this card for going first. Do I actually need it in that many combos? And does it actually win me games I otherwise wouldn't be able to win without it? And then for the last engine requirement, we're gonna have Regulus. I think this one is Also in a similar boat as Doomsday Destruction, except Regulus doesn't actually enable any of your combos. It just makes it so your combo's a little bit more insulated and your end board's a little bit better. This is also something I would ask myself if I really need in my combo, but I think at least at the moment, in theory at least, it's supposed to help protect you, insulate you against hand traps very early on in your combo, making it so the rest of your powerful combo can go through. And so I think that, especially because this card is not the worst draw in the world either, and the fact that it's very easily accessible throughout our combo, I think ultimately it's still worth having in the deck, at least for now. But again, this is something that might change after testing. So at this point, we've gone through the engine of the deck, plus the engine requirements. So now we're going to take a look at everything else in the deck that isn't a part of its main engine. This part I think is a little bit easier to do than the engine part, and you don't need to have as critical of an eye for this because we'll know which cards are good against most decks. You should most of the time just be able to slap in like the best ones into your deck, assuming of course there's no conflict with it. In this case, cards like Fua, Droll, Shifter, very solid hand traps against the metagame at the time of recording, so makes sense for us to have these. Board breakers, Forbidden Crown Super Polymerization, also very good into the current meta, so it makes sense to have these. Non-engine, I would say, is the most flexible part of any deck, so you can tailor this to either, let's say, like your local metagame, like locals, and you know like a majority of players are playing certain decks. You can tailor your non-engine to that. Let's say if you're going to, let's say, a bigger tournament and aren't sure what you're going to run into, you can also choose to play a non-engine that's more generic. Ultimately, this is a very flexible part of the deck building, and I think it's ultimately where your creativity is really going to be able to shine. So I won't talk about too much in terms of how to pick the right non-engine for Doomsday, because I think this ultimately depends on the exact state of the metagame at the current moment you're trying to play. But just keep in mind that this is probably the most flexible part of deck building, and there may not always be a quote-unquote correct ratio of a non-engine, as you'll probably see from the fact that people are playing different deck lists and still generally doing well with different non-engine. And then the last final thing I'll take a look at is actually the main deck count. And that's something that seems pretty silly. Like, okay, well, why does it matter if it's like 40, 41, 42, or 44? In the case of Doomsday, I think there is justification to playing 40, of course, like every other deck, just to make it as consistent as possible. When you're choosing to play more copies of cards, you're accepting that you're seeing certain cards a little bit less often, but that can be both a good or bad thing. The good thing is, well, this deck, like we mentioned, does have quite a few cards you don't necessarily want to draw. You rather search throughout your combo, so playing a higher deck count means you're slightly less likely to see those cards, which is a good thing. But on the flip side, it means you're seeing your good starters like Doomsday Change or Doomsday Alara a little bit less often. Also, this is something you can fiddle around with, just if you want. Let's say you want to fit in a specific number of non-engine, or you want to fit in specific cards. You can ultimately play around with the total number of cards in your main deck, but at the end of the day, just remember there are going to be small, minute changes to your deck's consistency and power level depending on how many cards you choose to play in your deck. The next thing I always look at is, of course, the extra deck. This also probably can be done in conjunction with when you're looking over the starters and the extenders of the deck. A lot of times, the extra deck monsters will likely fall into either that category or some like end board piece. And in the case of Doomsday, that's pretty much exactly what you see here. If you're familiar with the Doomsday combos, you'll know that you actually don't really need any more than one copy of like all these Xyz monsters you see here, aside from maybe Jupiter. And this is where we ask ourselves, okay, why has this player decided to play multiple copies of this card? One obvious reason is all-up terms. You want to go through another copy of the card. But in this format specifically, there is also the consideration of a card like Cool Tune Clip, which can randomly banish one of these from the extra deck, as you always want to make sure you have an extra copy of it. If you're choosing to playtest, just go with whatever the quote-unquote standard extra deck is at the start, and then as you play games, you want to ask yourself whether or not there are any cards I feel like the deck is missing or could be beneficial in some situations, and then after the testing process, go ahead and revise the deck. Now, finally, I wanted to quickly skim over the side deck section as well. I also don't really have too much to say about this part of deck building. It is going to ultimately depend on your own playstyle, what you value as a player. Let's say, for example, like I really value going second. I want to make sure I don't lose to like any specific deck. Maybe I'll play 12 cards for going second and only 3 cards for going first. Or you say like, I want to make sure I win every single game I get to go first post side. Maybe in this case, like this player, you'll end up choosing to play 7 cards for going first. And at the end of the day, the actual specific cards you're choosing to play in your side deck are going to change from time to time. And similar to what I said in the non-engine section, this is where your creativity is ultimately going to shine, because there is rarely ever an objectively correct way to build the side deck for any given deck. So at the end of the day, it's ultimately up to you how you choose to build it, and you can definitely see success with a variety of different card choices in this slot. Alright, so that's going to wrap up part 2 of this series, where I go over how to prepare for a new format as a competitive player. I know I definitely yapped quite a bit in this one, but I hope you guys were able to follow, and I hope you're able to find it useful. Again, like I mentioned at the start of the video, if you don't want to go through this process, you could just take a successful deck and just run with that. And then as you test, you can try to iterate on the deck after that. But if you have a little bit more experience with the format or more experience with the deck that you're trying to build, I think it's very beneficial to take a few moments to just sit down, go through the process that I just did, and really understand why certain cards are being played, certain cards aren't being played, and why certain ratios of cards are being played. Just so when you're doing testing, you have a little bit more context. Be sure to stay tuned for the last part of this series where I'm going to be going over how I would approach properly testing, just so you can get the most out of the time that you put into testing your new deck and testing for the new format. So do stay tuned for that. It should be coming out a little bit after this. Also, make sure to subscribe, not only so you don't miss the third part, but also if you found this video enjoyable or helpful. It really helps keep me motivated to keep posting more videos like this for the future. And it tells YouTube that you enjoyed this video, which will help me grow as a creator, which I greatly appreciate. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.